Welcome everyone to our PlayCleanGo webinar series. We're really excited to be jointly hosting this webinar with our partners to celebrate PlayCleanGo Awareness Week. My name is Gavin Nichols and I'm the Programs Manager with Invasives Canada, and I do focus on, part of my work focuses on the PlayCleanGo program. So to start off, I'm with Invasives Canada. We are a national nonprofit charitable organization and recognized as the national non-government voice on invasive species in Canada. We work with partners across Canada to protect ecosystems and communities from the impacts of invasive species. We're run by a 4-chamber board with representation from government, industry and business, Indigenous organizations, as well as our national chapter network, made up of invasive species councils representing different provinces and territories across Canada. We're also co-hosting this webinar with the North American Invasive Species Management Association, also known as NASMA, which is a nonprofit organization. Their mission is to empower invasive species management in North America. They work to promote the connection, the voice, and the tools needed to address invasive species through programs like PlayCleanGo. Professional development and educational opportunities through NASMA Academy, standards and certification programs, webinars and conferences, and initiatives that support collaboration and awareness across North America. We're also co-hosting with CANABIOS, which is Mexico's National Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity. Their mission is to generate, compile, and share knowledge about Mexico's biodiversity to guide its conservation and sustainability use for and by society. They are the central repository for biodiversity information, the host of the National System of Information on Biodiversity with over 50 million records, and have led national collaboration on invasive species initiatives. You can learn more by visiting their website, which is linked in the chat as well. So a little bit about PlayCleanGo, Stop Invasive Species in Your Track. PlayCleanGo is a shared international brand jointly managed by the North American Invasive Species Management Association, as well as Invasives Canada. NASMA holds the trademark in the US, and we hold the trademark in Canada for the program. Together, these organizations coordinate cross-border collaboration, program implementation, and brand consistency in partnership with Mexico's Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity. PlayCleanGo, Stop Invasive Species in Your Tracks is a continent-wide education and outreach campaign that empowers outdoor recreationists to prevent the spread of invasive species. The campaign delivers a clear, actionable message: clean your boots, gear, pets, and vehicles before and after outdoor adventures so that everyone can enjoy and protect North America's natural landscapes. And today, or I should say this week, we're excited to be celebrating PlayCleanGo Awareness Week, taking place until the 13th. This year's theme is We Protect the Places We Love. PlayCleanGo Awareness Week is a collaborative effort led by NASMA, Invasives Canada, and CANABIO, and partners across North America to inspire people to take simple actions to prevent the spread of invasive species. By connecting our shared love of our outdoors and practical prevention behaviors, we're helping protect trails, waterways, forests, parks, and other special places for future generations. Throughout the week, we have been sharing resources, hosting webinars, highlighting partner activities, and encouraging everyone to join in protecting the places they love. Also, this year, for the first time, we are hosting a webinar series for PlayCleanGo Week. So you're joining us here today. So you've successfully registered for one of them at least, which is great. But we've been hosting 3 webinars to date, and then have one final webinar this coming Friday. So definitely encourage you to register for that webinar if you haven't already. It will be presented in Spanish, but we'll have English subtitles. So before we dive into today's presentation, I want to briefly introduce boot brush stations and why they're such an important piece to invasive species prevention. As we've heard from people visiting natural areas, parks, and other recreational sites, people can unknowingly transport invasive species seeds and pests through soil and material stuck in their gear and on their footwear. While they may seem simple, boot brush stations do more than just provide a place to clean your shoes. They help overcome barriers to action by making it easy, convenient, and visible for visitors to remove seeds, soil, and other invasive species from their shoes before entering or leaving a recreational area. As we heard in our behavior change training webinar last week, if you were able to join us, boot brush stations support behavior change by placing the tools and information directly at trailheads where people need to see them. Boot brush stations then help turn awareness into action and make invasive species prevention a normal part of the outdoor experience. There have been many boot brushes installed across North America. Here's just a look at NASMA's excellent boot brush station map showing over 500 PlayCleanGo boot brush stations located across the US, and I think a couple in Canada as well. We are working with partners in Canada to map some of the boot brush stations as well, so that'll be coming soon, and hopefully we can add to this great map you see here. So this map is showing a growing network of invasive species prevention infrastructure at parks, trails, conservation areas, natural areas, and other recreation sites. The network of stations also supports brand recognition and behavior change. When visitors encounter the PlayCleanGo brand in multiple locations, they begin to recognize the message and the action we are asking them to take. The goal is not just to encourage someone to clean their boots at a single trailhead, but to help them take that behavior or make it a habit wherever they recreate. For organizations, installing a station means joining a larger community of partners committed to invasive species prevention. Each station contributes to a shared effort to educate visitors, encourage action, and protect the places we love. And with that, I'd like to turn our attention to today's presentation. So Invasive Species has been grateful to be partnering with Parks Canada, our national park system here in Canada, to implement the PlayCleanGo program since 2019. We've worked with multiple parks to implement PlayCleanGo boot brush stations, as well as other PlayCleanGo resources. So I'm excited today to share that today we'll be hearing from Parks Canada ecologist team lead Charlotte Brown to share their findings on seeds, invasive species, and landscape level patterns for boot brush stations at Elk Island National Park. And so just to introduce Charlotte before she joins us here, with a little bit of background. Charlotte Brown is based in Elk Island National Park and is an adjunct professor in the Biological Sciences Department at the University of Alberta. Her work focuses on invasive plant management, bison management, ecological monitoring, and supporting evidence-based decision-making to maintain ecosystem health. Charlotte completed her PhD in ecology at the University of Alberta, where her research examines species interactions and the processes of shaping native grassland communities. She has since held postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Arizona and the Université de Sherbrooke, which apologies for my pronunciation there, where she studied long-term vegetation change and responses to global change. Her current work bridges science and management, applying ecological research to real-world conservation challenges in Canada's protected areas. So with that, I want to thank Charlotte for joining us today and for this presentation, and I will pass it over to you, Charlotte.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabby. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Looks good. Okay, perfect. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I'm happy to talk to you all about some work that we've been doing in Elk Island related to PlayCleanGo stations that we set up. So before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that the work that this takes place is on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Nakota Sioux, and Métis peoples. I acknowledge that there have been generations of Indigenous people who have stewarded and continue to steward these lands, and I recognize our shared responsibility to work collaboratively in the spirit of good relations. I also want to shout out some people. This whole project was a collaborative effort with some people at the University of Alberta. And then I also wanted to highlight some key players at Elk Island National Park who really took the initiative to set up these PlayCleanGo stations at the park, as well as thank the whole Elk Island team in general for their support. So when we visit places like Elk Island, we often think about what we bring in, like what food we'll bring with us or gear for the day, but we're not necessarily thinking about what we might unintentionally carry with us. So tiny things like seeds get stuck to boots, clothing, or equipment and can travel long distances and end up in new environments. And so over time, what can happen is that this can change what grows in a place. And today we'll look at kind of some of those consequences for Elk Island National Park. And so by promoting clean recreation practices, we reduce the risk of new introductions and help protect native ecosystems. And as this is PlayCleanGo Awareness Week, I'll talk today about Elk Island National Park's journey in obtaining PlayCleanGo boot brush stations and how we've used these stations to monitor what species are coming into the park and what species are moving around the park. So just to orient ourselves a little bit, Elk Island National Park, which is denoted by the red star here, falls within the northern part of the Great Plains of North America. And then we can further subdivide that within the Canadian prairies. So Elk Island really falls into this aspen parkland ecoregion within the Canadian prairies. And this has actually been identified as by the IUCN as a critically endangered ecosystem. They referred to aspen parkland as the Northern Great Plains woodland. And so the aspen parkland is critically endangered due to the loss of habitat and low protection. So here I'm showing you the red historic range of the aspen parkland, and the green shows kind of the current distribution of intact aspen parkland with white borders showing protected areas. So you can see that Elk Island National Park is one of the largest protected areas within Alberta of this system. And it's also part of the UNESCO Beaver Hills biosphere, which is reflected in the inset here. And so what is the aspen parkland? It's kind of a transitional ecosystem between the boreal forest to the north and the Great Plains to the south. So it's characterized by a mosaic of grasslands, aspen groves, and wetlands. It's highly productive and is the home for many species at risk in waterfowl breeding habitat. But perhaps when you think of Elk Island National Park, you kind of think of us as being the bison people. Despite the fact that the park was originally established in the early 1900s as an elk refuge, we received a small herd of bison shortly after that. And that's now expanded, and Elk Island is a key player in global bison conservation by transferring bison to people around the world. But within Elk Island National Park, like the aspen parkland system in general, we're having a loss of habitat. So in Elk Island National Park, we've lost 50 to 60% of our grasslands over the past 20 to 25 years, mostly due to woody encroachment. So we only have 5% of grasslands in the park remaining today. And a further threat to our grassland ecosystems are invasive species, which reduce the health of the grasslands and can further reduce the habitat and forage availability for our ungulate friends by up to 20%. And so because Elk Island is really close to Edmonton, a major city in Canada, about 40 minutes away, we get a lot of visitation to the park, primarily to see bison and also to enjoy the outdoors within a short distance from a major city limit. And so because we have these threats of woody encroachment, invasive species, and high visitor use, Parks Canada has invested in a project to increase the health of the grassland systems in Elk Island National Park, which actually facilitated our work with PlayCleanGo and Invasives Canada. So just a little bit about Elk Island's visitation. So we have around roughly 400 to 500,000 visitors each year. And this is a pretty drastic increase in the past 20 years. And we've had some spikes due to free entry in COVID. And so we have another free entry summer coming up. So we expect high visitation as well. But when we think about this visitation in relationship to how big our park is, we're actually one of the national parks within Canada with the highest visitation density. So we see something around 2,500 visitors per kilometer squared in our parks. And when we look at what that visitation looks like in terms of temporal breakdown, a lot of that visitation is occurring between July and October, which is key windows for seed dispersal within the system. So Elk Island has 11 trails, which leads to us to have roughly 87 kilometers of trails. And from a visitor survey that was conducted in 2022 of roughly 4,000 visitors, we learned 77% of visitors use these trails. So this translates to just under 400,000 people per year using the trails. And so as part of that larger conservation and restoration project focused on increasing the health of Elk Island's grassland systems, we installed PlayCleanGo stations at 8 trailheads throughout the park in 2021. And we further know that from those visitor surveys that there's very variable usage amongst our trail systems in the park. So for example, one of our most used trails, Lakeview, receives just under 20,000 people per kilometer per year. And the least, one of the least used trails receives just over 2,000 people per kilometer per year. So that's quite a difference between the trails within our park in terms of visitor usage. And just because it's hard to kind of visualize what that looks like, I thought it'd be fun to give you an example of the Boston Marathon, which I'm sure we've all watched on TV. But the Boston Marathon brings roughly 715 people per kilometer. So just imagine that level of crowd in Elk Island, 3 to 27 times that moving throughout our trail systems within a year. And so because we had this high visitation, we really wanted to know how that impacted how plants and invasive plants moved throughout the park. And so that led us to a partnership with the University of Alberta, which was led by 2 really great undergrad students. They collaborated on a thesis together on this. And they asked, how different are the seeds spread by people compared to those spread naturally within sites between trails and overall? How do geographic location and visitor activity influence what seeds people are spreading? And they also looked to see if there were certain plant traits that make species more likely to be dispersed by people, but I won't be talking about that work today. And so what they did and what we did was we added what we are calling an air trap within 10 meters of each boot brush station, each of the 8 boot brush stations that we have throughout the park. And what this does is it allows us to compare what's being brought by humans versus what's kind of being naturally moved throughout the landscape through wind, through birds, potentially larger animals, but they'd have to walk over that air trap. So just giving us kind of a sense of human versus non-human dispersed vectors. And I just actually wanted to take a moment here to talk about our boot brush station manufacturing. So we have, the way that we set it up, we're able to slide a tray under our boot brush station so that we can collect the material that's being wiped off. I don't often, like that doesn't normally happen on all boot brush stations, but it's a really clever way that allowed us to be able to collect that material for the study to monitor what's there. But we also, outside of monitoring, collect that material so that we can dispose of it so that we are not keeping those seeds on the landscape. So just a tidbit for anyone who's thinking about creating some of these boot brush stations themselves. So we collected soil and seeds from these stations and air traps monthly. And because there is quite a variable amount of soil collected in each of the boot brush stations due to visitor usage or weather or things like that, we had quite a variable amount of soil, something from like about a cup of soil to almost a gallon of soil. So in order to kind of standardize amongst trailheads, we just subsetted that to having just under a cup of soil that we're taking and growing out to see what seeds are there. It also helped control our germination numbers so that we didn't overwhelm our undergrad students. And so what we did was we took those samples and grew them out in a greenhouse. So we had 94 samples in total, 8 sites by 6 months by 2 dispersal vectors, those boot brushes versus those air traps. And then we also had some control trays, which was just sterilized soil that helped us see if there was any seeds floating around the greenhouse that would be biasing some of our samples. So we grow these samples out for 3 months, letting all germinations happen and counting them and identifying what species they were. And then we did 2 soil rotations, which kind of churned up the soil and allows for more germinations once they like peter out a little bit from the top layer. So despite our efforts to reduce the workload for our undergraduate students, they identified and counted 8,500 germinations, just above that. And there was a bit of discrepancy between the number of germinations in air trays versus those boot brush stations. We did find more germinations within the boot brush, but I do want to caveat here that more material in general is collected in the boot brush than the air trays. And so we can't really compare the amount of seeds spread through these dispersal mechanisms. But what we can do is compare patterns within a treatment. So we can see here for the boot brush stations, there's a general pattern of more seeds are spread August through October. But we don't necessarily see that same pattern for those air traps. They're fairly regular July through October, with maybe a peak in September. And then just quickly, we do see that there are increased germinations August through October. And this doesn't necessarily correspond with our highest visitor use. We tend to have most visitors in July and August. And then also we kind of look to see if it's the species specific effects that are leading to these spikes in August through October. But the species that kind of had the most amount of germinations, Kentucky bluegrass and plantain, were also high in other months. So there's something going on that's leading to this spike in September and October outside of visitor use or species-specific differences in essentially when they seed and disperse. So when we extrapolate out with the number of germinations that we have and the amount of soil that we collected in our boot brush stations, we found that we collected over 30,000 viable seeds from these boot brush stations within a summer. And we identified 63 different species. So what we found was that the boot brush station, so human dispersed seeds, humans carried 56% unique species. There was a shared amount of species between air trap and boot brush, but there were some species that were unique to the boot brush stations, which I think we can then suggest were carried by humans. And like with the amount of soil collected in seed germinations, we can't necessarily say that more species are carried by boot brush stations than air traps just with our study design alone. And so what we did is we used kind of a statistical approach to control for the amount of germinations that we had to see whether there were actually differences in species richness or the number of species in samples between air traps and boot brush stations. And when we extrapolate out, so like on this graph that I'm showing you, where those dotted arrows are, that was the observed species richness that we saw. And then anything beyond that is an extrapolated value based on kind of random redraws of individuals that germinated to project out species richness. And we can see there's not really a difference between the air and boot brush in this case. And perhaps maybe there's a trend to having air trap dispersed seeds as a higher species richness. And so what did we find in terms of the number of introduced or invasive species? So here I'm going to show you 3 different categorizations of introduced to invasive species. So introduced is just any non-native species that we use FastCan to determine the historic distribution of that species. And then invasive species, which are ranked within Parks Canada, but are not necessarily regulated through any provincial legislation. And then we also have Alberta regulated invasive. So these are ones that have legal implications through the Alberta Weed Control Act. And on the y-axis here, we have the amount of species that we found that falls into these categories. So because we found more species in boot brush stations than in air traps, the denominator essentially of these proportions will be different based on the 2 sample types. So what we found was that boot brush stations had a higher proportion of introduced species than did the air samples. But we didn't see that reflect in our invasive species. They had very similar amounts of invasive species compared to the amount of species that were found in these samples. And then similarly with the regulated invasive species, we saw a slight increase in the number of species within boot brush stations, but it's very negligible essentially compared to that of the air samples. But what does differ is what those species are. So here I'm showing you what species differed between the 2 types of samples, the human dispersed versus those that kind of naturally disperse. And there's a difference in what species were found, but what's more important for Elk Island is some of these are novel species to our system. So we don't have cleavers or downy brome in the park in high distributions or at all. Like we don't have any known occurrences. So this means that there is the potential that humans are introducing species that we don't have currently in the park. And then for the species that were unique to the air traps, I think a little bit is about where we place those air traps, because they were kind of sometimes along the edge of like the forest or uncut grass, for example. And so I think this led to maybe that boundary effect of having Caragana and reed canary found in these samples. Okay, so now that we kind of had a sense of what species were found in the samples, we wanted to know how the different composition of what seeds we found differed amongst trailheads with different geographic distances and visitor usage. So if we assume that hypothetically, as we increase the distance between trails, we should have an increase in dissimilarity between what species are kind of naturally dispersed in that area, just because there is heterogeneity on that landscape and we're picking up different species as we increase distance between sampling points. So for example, walking you through this figure, if we start on the left-hand side, this would be really close by trailheads. So if we look at 5 and 7, for example, Amisk and Beaver Pond, if we're comparing what seeds are naturally floating around those areas compared to comparing, for example, 7 and 11, which are really far away from each other, how similar or dissimilar are those seeds between those 2 sites? So if we can assume that we have an increase in dissimilarity as we increase the distance between the trails, we could see if visitors make the environment more similar by, even though you increase in distance, the similarity of what is in boot brush stations is the same. And so that's actually what we found. So we did see that assumption that with our air trap samples, those naturally dispersed seeds, as we increase the different distance between two trailheads, we did have a more dissimilar composition of what species were being naturally dispersed in those areas. But then when we look at this with the boot brush stations, where the human dispersed seeds, we don't see that difference. So regardless of how far away two trails are from one another, the seeds in those boot brush stations are the same in terms of composition. And so what this means is that humans really have the potential to homogenize the environment by introducing the same species pool in different parts of the landscape. And then we wanted to see how visitor usage might impact this. So here again, we have that dissimilarity on our Y. So things on the bottom of the graph are similar in composition in terms of the seed mix, and seeds on the top are very different from one another. And on our x-axis now we have the difference in visitor use. So if we're comparing, for example, Hayburger, that really low use trail for visitors, versus Lakeview, that high visitor use. Do those differ a lot in what species are there, or are they the same? And we found that they're the same. So regardless of how much more visitors use boot brush stations, the composition or what species are found in those boot brush stations remain the same. So just some conclusions. Visitors can carry a lot of seeds and can introduce new species to an area. For us, downy brome and cleavers were two species that were identified as being carried by humans, but not actually found in the park yet. Boot brush stations can reduce the spread of seeds and track what visitors are bringing in. It was a really powerful tool for us to see what's being spread throughout the landscape. And then if you add that additional air trap tray, you can then kind of look at the difference between what's moving around without humans and what humans are bringing in to really look at the impacts of human on the landscape. And then, in my opinion, perhaps some of the biggest impacts are making different areas more similar. So that homogenization effect, which means that we're losing biodiversity, which in the science world, beta diversity would be the term. So the difference in species found in two different sites. And this has a lot of implications for for biodiversity. So we'd have less habitat differentiation to support different species. Perhaps the landscape is becoming more vulnerable to change and less resilient because there's less of a buffering effect when having different species on the landscape. And then just some potential for future work and kind of also caveats to the work that I talked about today. Is that this work, we didn't look to see what has actually established from those boot brush stations or from visitors using trails. We're just really monitoring what is on their boots. And so future work could look to see whether the species found in the boot brush stations are at higher abundances around the trails. And then also, we don't know when visitors are using the boot brush stations, whether it's before the trail, they go on the trail, after they go on the trail, or both. And so in terms of management implications for the park of reducing the spread of species, if visitors aren't using the boot brush stations before they go out on the trail, that's less impactful for us, but still useful for the whole landscape as a whole if they still brush their shoes after they leave the park, because then they're not bringing seeds from the park elsewhere. So then I'll quickly just finish by reminding you to do your due diligence next time you take a hike. What you do carry around a lot of seeds on you that can have impacts for the landscape. So clean your boots before and after you use a trail. If a trail system has a boot brush designated boot brush station, that's great. But you can also buy these hand boot brush picks so that you can do it no matter where you are. Sorry, my cat just walked across the screen. Please stay on the trail. This helps contain what species that you're bringing on your boots stays kind of in a localized area rather than moves out within the back country. Report invasives, two tools that we at Elk Island use is iNaturalist and EdMaps, and take the PlayCleanGo pledge, which you can find on the Invasives Canada page and also the PlayCleanGo page. And with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. That was an excellent presentation and really cool to see how the boot brushes are being used and even the seeds that kind of came off of them too. So really interesting study. Thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate it. And I did just want to say too, Charlotte and a few other researchers have done this work on, seeing the efficacy of some of the boot brush stations. And we definitely encourage others who are maybe interested in this type of work to look at this research too and connect with us on that as well. So hopefully we can continue to kind of grow the research around this work. So thanks, Charlotte, for that. All right, we do have a few questions here. First question, I'm a graduate student at the University of Northern BC, and I'm doing a case study on the use of boot brush stations at the trailhead. It would be great to include some of your findings in the study. Is there any publication of your research?
Thanks for that question. Not yet. This was part of two undergraduate theses, so it is in some stage of draft form, and we're working on getting that to publication, but nothing has been published to date. But I'm pretty sure you've reached out. I think I saw your email come in my inbox this morning, so I'm happy to follow up after this too about ways that we can work together.
Excellent. Yeah, hopefully we can share that once it's published too. Some other questions that we have here. Are there any invasive plants are in the park that their seeds weren't collected by the boot brush or even like the air trap? I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, there certainly are. So I didn't talk about it, but invasive species that were found in both in terms of those regulated ones. Thistle, scentless chamomile, and caraway are all ones that were found, but then we have other noxious weeds in the park that weren't found. So like, for example, white cockle or toadflax. So we definitely did not see some invasive species in the boot brush, which we have a really robust adopt a patch program at Elk Island. So I will maybe attribute that to the great work that they do, that they keep the invasives down at the trailheads in the front country. So we're not picking them up in these areas.
That's great. Another question for you. When you mentioned the air trap, I was curious the design of that and also how you determined where to position those to sort of be the natural spread of invasive species or represent that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the biggest things that we had to think about were drainage. So we actually cut some holes in them and laid a mesh so that they could drain but retain the materials. And then also for us bison, they kick things around quite a bit as they move throughout the landscape, so maybe less applicable to others. So we had to really reinforce them to the ground so that they stayed in place. And then we put that mesh on top to kind of keep larger things out of it and collect the smaller seeds. And in terms of placement, we just tried to put them in a location that was still representative of the site where the boot brush was, but far enough away from where visitors actively were using so that they wouldn't interact with it very much. So we kind of like hid it off to the side, but still made sure that the site was representative.
Excellent. That's really interesting. I think you touched on this a little bit, but do you have an idea of the percentage of visitors that use the boot brushes? I know you kind of mentioned it was maybe more of a follow-up study, but is there any indication, and I guess as a follow-up to that, um, is there any idea on how you might be able to track that, like a trail cam or something like that?
To my knowledge, I don't know if we have any data on how often visitors use the boot brush station. Um, I do think it would be really interesting to do that as a follow-up study using something like trail cameras, but making sure that privacy is protected. Or we like visitor surveys is also a possibility, but then there's like that social science aspect of people not necessarily telling the truth. So maybe a combination, but yeah, definitely interested for future follow-ups and collaborating on how to look into those questions.
That's great. Um, And I was curious too, of the invasive species that you were able to capture, are there ones that are of greater concern to the park and the biodiversity there? Are there ones that you were hoping to capture that you didn't see? That type of thing.
That's a good question. We definitely prioritize invasives internally based on what we perceive their potential impact to be, because there's a lot to do and not always the resources. So they are definitely priority invasives for us. I would say for this program, in terms of what we'd hope to collect, are those species that aren't in the park yet, or species that might be in the park in really low abundances, so would still fall into that early detection, rapid response type management. So we did see some of those for our species, which was nice. Like scentless chamomile isn't too widespread throughout the park. But it would, yeah. So we do prioritize. It would, I don't know what it means. Like that's the nice thing about the follow-up study is like just because we're not capturing those like higher priority species for us doesn't necessarily mean the boot brushes aren't doing their job, right? They just might not be on the landscape to be dispersed. So there'd have to be some parsing out of that a little bit.
No, for sure. Thanks. And another question for you, just because I think a lot of the folks on this call would be really interested in that boot brush design. It's not something we always see with the sort of grate and the tray underneath. Um, I think that's really interesting. It would be great to share more broadly, but I'm curious, just from your experience with collecting the seeds and everything, is there any other sort of recommendations or changes to the design that you might have for future installations or for other parks interested in installing boot brush stations?
Yeah, I think we are able to slide a tray under there, but like as soil moves and accumulates throughout time, it's definitely harder each year to be able to shove the tray in there. So if you could have more clearance, and then it also is a means of how often you're able to service it and what your visitor usage is. So if you're having really high visitor usage, a small tray would have to be emptied quite regularly if you wanted to kind of like bag and control what seeds are in there. So potentially the thing to think about is if you have high visitor usage and you won't be able to service the sites very frequently, could you increase that clearance so that you can have a deeper tray to store more seed, essentially? But those are just my rough thoughts. I'm sure there's some engineers out there that could come up with a better design.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I know there's quite a few different approaches people have taken, so yeah, very cool design to see. And I think just as a final question here, going forward, how will the findings from this study impact Elk Island's invasive species management and visitor outreach? Are there sort of any actions that the park's going to take based on what you found here?
Yeah, so the park is kind of starting a visitor use management plan. And so part of this work might go into speaking towards kind of how visitors impact the landscape, and then that gets put into consideration of how we manage things. Um, And so it is potential, like it's nice to know what's being spread around and the impact that that has, and that might translate up into management efforts for sure.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for that great presentation. I think there was a lot of interest. I could see a lot of comments coming through in the chat there, and we've put Charlotte's email in the chat in case you wanted to reach out for any follow-up there. And I see lots of thanks as well to Charlotte. So thanks, Charlotte, very much for today. I think we learned a lot, and we will be posting the recording in the coming weeks here so we can follow up with everyone who's interested in checking those out. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us on behalf of Invasives Canada, NAISMA, and Cannabio. Again, hoping this work can inspire others to do the same and continue some of this research as well. And with that, I think we'll end it here. So thanks, everyone. And thanks again, Charlotte, for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.